This is the video podcast for Chapter 12 on non-tidal wetland hydrology. And as you can see, I'm mixing up a little bit today and I'm moving outside. So being outside, who knows what's going to happen. You might hear some birds or other noises. I'll do my best to try to stay focused. The sun is going to change, but I think it's a little bit fun, and especially when we're talking about wetlands. Now, wetlands are something that ecologists have studied for a long time. It's really right at the core of understanding plant succession, but it's something that hydrologists are relatively new to studying. And in the non-tidal wetland context, it's relatively recent that some really interesting ideas have been developed about the overall context of water flows and water balances in non-tidal wetlands. So what I want to do in this video podcast is work through non-tidal wetland ecology, first looking at the status of wetlands in the United States, then looking at how plants have adapted to waterlogging, and then moving on to a hydrological classification of non-tidal wetlands. That's the general theory, and then we're going to look at two specific applications, one involving a model and the other one looking at a field study. Okay, well, the status of wetlands in the United States is something that we needed more information on. And as a result of that, in 1989, there was the North American Wetland Conservation Act that amended a previous one and specifically called for an estimation of the amount of wetlands that existed in the U.S. in 1780, and then an assessment of how much was present in 1980, and as a result of that, getting a sense of how much change there has been in the area of wetlands in the United States. I'll illustrate this with a couple of different graphs, but this first one here shows maps of the area of the U.S. and then by state, the percent that was existing as wetlands. So it's important to appreciate this is on a percent basis. So a state like California might have a lot of total acres of wetlands, but on a percent basis, it doesn't add up to a whole lot. So there are 221 million acres of wetlands in the 1780s, but that by the 1980s, that had been reduced by 53%. And northern states like Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan, which had 25 to 50% of their area as wetlands, saw significant reductions, about half. You could see the southern states like Florida and Louisiana having very significant reductions, and other states seeing near total losses, states like Ohio. So this is on a percent basis. We could also look at the data on an area basis, and here you can see a state like California, which doesn't necessarily have a lot of wetlands overall in comparison to a few other states, but 91% of the wetlands that were present in the 1780s were gone by the 1980s. 91%. And so other states like Ohio and Indiana saw similarly high reductions. A lot of states have been hit really hard, but these inland states like Illinois, Arkansas had very large areas of wetlands and saw them all lost. Here within the Central Valley of California, we have this alluvial lowland that much of the state drains to. If we look at historically, like here in 1820, it's kind of hard to see, but there's a large area of wetlands, including Tulare Lake. And so that large area of wetlands has primarily been lost. Prior to the mid-1800s, about 4 million of the 13 million acres that made up the Central Valley were wetlands, and almost all of that is gone now. Okay, so talking about hydrology, now, obviously there's a key context. Like you can see the importance of understanding the hydrology of wetlands as one of the steps necessary in order to conserve and protect wetlands or restore or enhance them. So to get a water balance, we're going to be looking at this with two key points in mind. Trying to decide whether the primary fluxes are vertical or horizontal, and whether there are sources and sinks. And, if a wetland is a source of stuff, then stuff is leaving the wetland, it's feeding other areas. If it's a sink, then whatever is coming into it is stopping there. And that's the kind of thing that we want to understand using water balances. A lot of times ecologists will want to study the ecology of something, and they'll be like, hey, Greg, can you tell me what the hydrology is? And what I tell them is, sure, we can work on that, but it's a big effort unto itself. It's not like you quickly get the hydrology and then, oh, poo-poo that and move on to the ecology, right? We need to look at it all together, and what I want to show you is a perspective of how we can do that. Well, the first step is, of course, the water balance. And these diagrams here show examples of generally more vertical water balances compared to what I'm going to show you next for the horizontal balances. So we can just make a black box, or black line, but that's the box is the wetland, and you have your precipitation in and evapotranspiration out, and then some surface flows and groundwater flows in and out. And so let's start here. So a bog, remember, a bog is one that really has no inflows and no outflows. And so you can see here 145 units of precipitation in, 102 units going out. And that means that there's some vertical accumulation, water filling up the bog. And then, fine, there's a small amount of water, and they don't know if it's going out on the surface of the ground, but it's relatively small, about, what's that, not even 1/5, maybe like 1/7 or so of the water that comes in goes out by that mechanism. Remember, the fen is a flow-through system, so here you have a system that is precipitation of 100 units, and what's interesting is in this case there's some inflow, but there's a lot of outflow. So this would be an example where you have, half of the water is leaving by vertical balance, but this is a wetland that is a source. Like, water is leaving, so the wetland is a source, and it's not much of a sink because the whatever's coming in from upland is relatively small. Here's another example where you have some variation that's here, but in general, more precipitation than evaporation, and that means that there's a net outflow. So this is another example where the wetland is a source rather than a sink. Now, if we look at the horizontal water balance examples, you see a dramatic difference. Here, these horizontal flows, they're not like 100 units the way precipitation was in those other cases. We have thousands. Here we have a flooding river, 5,300 units of water, going by, 229 coming in, 232 going out. So a near perfect horizontal balance. And then besides that, there are these vertical fluxes that are taking place, but there are comparative small numbers relative to the surface inflows and outflows. On the right, we have a lake. So in this lake, you have very large amounts of water. The lake rises, water comes in. The lake goes down, it goes out. And so you have these very large fluxes that are taking place, and really small vertical water balance. Here's an interesting example. I don't know that it's really a good example of a horizontal balance itself. Like, it certainly doesn't have fluxes like the top two. But what it shows is the connectivity between the wetland and the watershed, and that's why I put it in here. So here we've got a water balance for the uplands with a net export of 39 units in surface and groundwater. That's going into the swamp. And then the swamp also has a near balanced vertical component, precipitation and ET, with the excess going out as surface flow. So it just shows that, these other cases are generally looking at the wetland water balance in isolation, but in this case we're looking at it together with the context of the watershed that's feeding into it. Okay, now I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about plants that are adapted to living in wetlands. Not worrying about salinity per se, but just focusing on water. There are generally two approaches that plants can evolve over generations to make this adaptation. So what happens when soils become waterlogged is that the soils don't have free oxygen as O2 available in the air, because that's what roots need. Roots receive dissolved oxygen, water, and nutrients, and some of that is dissolved in the water, but it also needs the exposed oxygen. So if there's a deficit of oxygen in the roots, then you either have to have roots of some kind that aren't exposed, aren't underwater, and we call those adventitious roots, or you have to have a very high porosity in the tree itself or in the plant so that air can literally diffuse into that, whether it's in the leaves or in the stem. So that second approach is what we call aeronkema, And I've given you a pronunciation here because it's a very strange word to look at it, but Aeronchyma involves air spaces in roots, stems, and leaves that allow diffusion of oxygen down into the submerged biomass. So what we're talking about here are like water lilies or these standing plants like Peltantra. And what you have is you have very round stems. And with those round stems, there are lots of little pores that are inside that. And those pores tend to be very tubular. So they can be sponge-like, but being tubular allows for whatever is diffusing in through the sidewall to then move more freely vertically down into the roots. And so like in this case with the newfar, only the leaves are exposed for, most of the hours of the day. So air has to be able to diffuse into the branching structure in the leaves and then move through these tube-like structures down to the roots. With something like Peltandra, maybe it's only inundated, 4 to 10 hours a day. And so then you can get a lot more airflow through the whole stem, air diffusing in, even if the roots are perennially underwater. Adventitious roots are well exemplified by mangroves, and here's a photo of red mangroves. Adventitious roots are growing above the waterline, but then they're arcing down into the water. And if you zoom in close, you'll see these little pores that are called lenticles, which is where the air is exchanging, and then that air can go down into the ground. Another example is the case of the oxygen benefits exhibited by rice. So showing you some more specific data, rice copes with submergence using internal aeration and its growth control. So for example, if we look at the junction between the stem and the root, which is shown at 0, and then down to the tip of the root, which is like 6 centimeters away in this case, we can look at the amount of oxygen present in the root and the radial oxygen loss, like loss out through the root. Now these are not measurements, this is being calculated with a model, but still the point is you can get a sense of how this works. And so with this model you can see that the roots have anywhere from like 12 to 22% oxygen, so very high concentrations of oxygen, whereas non-wetland roots have more oxygen at the surface and then they lose their oxygen in the saturated soil. Meanwhile, rice can lose its oxygen, all throughout, but it seems to preferentially lose it at the root tips. And what that means is that oxygen that's coming in all along the system is being retained and then moving out through the tip. So it's moving out, whereas the non-wetland root is losing its oxygen more towards the stem, and then the bottom of the root is more shut off. So in the way that I've gone into detail about a few of those species, people have actually done a very systematic analysis for a large number of different plant species to try to see how they cope, or if they cope, or how long it takes for them to succumb to waterlogging. And there's a very nice report by Teskey and Hinckley from 1978 that goes through a whole bunch of different species and then gives you what the outcome of what will happen to them. So if we look at the eastern cottonwood, we can look at mature tree or seedling. Seedlings can differentiate adventitious roots, but if you look at the mature trees, so we have these two different studies, study 14 and 11, so it's pulling from the literature. And in one study, they looked at partial submersion, that's what the B indicates, and then the 1 indicates during the growing season. And you can see that there was 100% survival after 73 days. On the other hand, with B3, we have partial submersion year-round. In this case, these mature trees died after 2 years. So it takes quite a long time for that to happen. So you can just see how a table like this would be very useful, that if you're working with plants, like you're doing some kind of landscaping or land management, you want to know what the effects of flooding is going to be, or if you were going to institute flooding regime as a part of some project, this could give you some good, anecdotal, sort of, descriptive science evidence about what might happen. Okay, so I want to switch gears again and move from those plant adaptations to looking at systematically what is the nature of hydrology in non-tidal wetlands. And to do this, no surprise here, we're going to whip out the water balance, but we're just going to do a few little tricks on it. We're going to bring back some old friends and introduce you to some new ones. So the first old friend, of course, is the water balance. And here we've got the change in storage in the wetland equals the inflows minus the outflows. No surprises there. One thing that's interesting, though, is what if we want to compare a wetland? Like, what if I want to compare, a wetland at UC Merced, like a vernal pool with a sphagnum bog in Alaska, with heathland, in England? How would I compare those dramatically different wetlands? Well, the answer is that because they have, such widely different absolute magnitudes of flows, one might have 100 units of water, one might have 5. We can't just go based on straight numbers, so what we have to do is non-dimensionalize. And that basically means nothing more than converting it to percents. But in fluid mechanics and hydrology, the concept of non-dimensionalization is very important. It's trying to say that it doesn't matter what the absolute number of something is, it matters, relatively speaking, whether one place or another has more of it or less of it as a percent of the total. So here you see a whole bunch of equations, but they're really relatively simple. All we have is an index where we take one of the inflows, like discharge or surface water run-on, and we divide it by the total inflows, okay, and then multiply it by 100 to make it a percent. So we have 3 inflow constituents: groundwater, surface water, and rain. So we have 3 individual indices here, and together, by definition of a percent, these have to sum to 100%. Same thing for the outflows. We just take surface water outflow, groundwater outflow, and evapotranspiration and come up with an index for each one of those. So if we take the inflows and the outflows, since there's 3 terms, we can bring back your good friend the ternary diagram and classify each wetland on the basis of its ternary position, with 7 positions represented by dividing these into thirds. Each one of these into thirds, we get 7 different classes. So the left triangle is showing us 7 inflow classes, and on the right, 7 outflow classes. So we could ask you a question like, what are the conditions for class 5? Well, that would be groundwater inflows of roughly 80%, surface water inflows of about 10%, and precipitation inflows of about 10%. So those would sum to 100. So this gives you a chance to practice some more with ternary diagrams. The problem with doing a classification like this is that we've got 49 different classes of wetlands, 7 for inflows and 7 for outflows. We don't want to have 49 classes. That's just too much. That's too much effort. So we need to introduce you to a new friend, a new kind of diagram that I'm sure you're going to love. And that is, welcome, my friends, to the Piper diagram. The Piper diagram is a diamond, and somehow it interfaces with these ternary diagrams. So let me explain that to you. Now, it actually isn't as hard as you want. If you take your head and you just turn it like this, it kind of looks like a Cartesian graph that somebody has just stretched. Like if you just took the corners and stretched it out, it's really nothing more than a regular XY Cartesian graph with one twist. And that twist is that the x-axis, which is shown across the top, has been reversed. So small numbers are to the right and large numbers are to the left. And the reason that was done is they want the very bottom is going to have small numbers for both axes, and the very top is going to have big numbers for both axes. So it isn't really as hard as it think, it's just that you're not familiar with it. The left axis shows groundwater plus surface water outflows. That's 2 of the 3 outflows. That essentially represents a horizontal outflow. The one part that's missing, evapotranspiration, that's the vertical component. So if this left axis is high, you have a high horizontal exit, which would mean that this place is a source because water is leaving from this source. If you have a low value, then water isn't leaving out, carrying stuff with it. It's leaving by evapotranspiration. Okay, on the other axis, you've got groundwater plus surface water inflows. And so that means that this is a sink, like it's receiving water from somewhere else in very large amounts. So for example, if we look at class 4, we have 80 to 100 of surface water plus groundwater inflows. And so number 4 would be really small groundwater fluxes and small outflows and large inflows. And that's the one tricky thing that sometimes I get a little twisted in my mind, is that you think that the left side would be close to these words. The left side doesn't mean high outflow. The left side means you have to look at the numbers on this side. The number 4 here, Roman numeral 4, goes with 80% or greater surface water plus groundwater inflows. So what we want to understand is how you interpret this Piper diagram from left to right and from top to bottom. So first we're going to start with top to bottom. What does it mean to be a number 1 versus a number 9 wetland? And just remember, we've taken a total of 49 different classifications and reduced them down to 9. Let me introduce you to the wetland interaction with the landscape index, WIL. WIL is an indicator of how horizontal the fluxes are. If you have all of your water coming in from a channel and all of your water going out from a channel, that would be like perfect wetland interaction with the landscape. It's interacting both on the inflow side and on the outflow side. So we see groundwater plus surface water inflows, groundwater plus surface water outflows. So that's a purely horizontal condition. Now, what if you have very high inflows and very low outflows? That's not a purely non-interactive. Like, that would be an intermediate condition. And so these numbers tell you for different values of WIL what the level of interaction would be considered. If you don't want to think about it in terms of groundwater and surface water flows, you could simply recast it using the water balance equation to put it in terms of the vertical aspect. So here we've got the inflow from rain and the outflow from ET, and these are all negative. So the stronger you have a vertical balance in terms of all of your inflows coming from rain and all of your outflows going to ET, then the lower WIL can be. And the minimum that this can be is 0. The other thing we can do is we can look at the relative roles of surface water inflows or outflows. So if the outflows are greater than the inflows, that means that it's losing water, which means that the wetland is a source to downstream areas. If it's the opposite, then the wetland is a sink. And we can just play with the water balances to see how that goes in terms of converting it to the other things. But the bottom line is that if you have a very high SSI, then you have much stronger, let's see, high SSI here, you have stronger outflows and inflows, so you're a strong source. So let's go back to the Piper diagram and try to figure this out. If you're at the top, you have high inflows and high outflows from surface water and groundwater. That means you have a nearly, the highest possible WIL value. So high wetland interaction with the environment. You're receiving stuff from upstream, you're giving it out downstream, you're highly interactive. Think of a wetland type that falls into that category. For example, slope wetlands. Slope wetlands are receiving these flows from uplands and just shooting it straight out downlands. Very high horizontal flux, very high interaction with the landscape. If we go straight down to number 9, if those are off, you basically have a bog. Like, rain is coming down and evapotranspiration is going out. There's really no interaction with the landscape around it. It's just having this vertical balance, and as a result of that, it's very self-contained and isolated from the landscape. If we're a number 4 would be a case where you're having very strong inflows and very small outflows, and so that's a case then where it's a sink, like stuff's coming in and not going out, it's a sink. Number 6 would be the pure case of a source. So, like strong wetland interaction, weak wetland interaction, and then sink or source. So what you could think about is just go back to the hydrogeomorphic method and think about all the different kinds of wetlands. Like, what if you're a mineral flat? Well, if you're a mineral flat, you're receiving water from upstream when it rains, so you might have a high surface water inflow, but there's no surface water outflow. So that would be something towards the left here. If it's a really dry condition, maybe it's a 7, might be a 4. Just depends on what these, the relative magnitudes are. But in general, a mineral flat would be, interacting only in one direction. So, not entirely not interactive, right? So it would be somewhere here, but this direction would be in terms of receiving, so being a sink. Okay, so you can play with that Piper diagram and just reflect on a few things. I've already mentioned hydrogeomorphic position. Climate, arid conditions are generally going to be places where wetlands are sinks, and moist climates, they tend to be more sources. The study by Nontidal 1997 is where you can go to see more details on this. It also presents example data from 19 different wetlands with numbers for inflows and outflows, and puts these onto the Piper diagram. So you can see that they're falling into two groups. One group is having very strong interactions with the landscape, and one group is having much weaker interactions. So in comparison to just using the two ternary diagrams, the Piper diagram is simplifying it down to just the horizontal flux versus vertical flux, and then providing two interesting interpretations of that. So if you had to do a hydrological analysis, like if you were a consultant, this gives you a very simple and powerful tool to tell your client something about what's going to be happening with the wetlands, like how it's interacting with the environment. Is it a source or is it a sink? Okay, so part 2 for this chapter, shouldn't that say, well, anyway, I'm just realizing there's a lot of funky chapter notations here, but forget that for right now. I'll fix that for the handout, for the PDF file. So for part 2, I'm going to show you a use from DRAINMOD. DRAINMOD is a model that we can use to model wetland hydrology, and I'm going to show you how that can be used to assess the impacts of different land uses. And then I'm also going to be showing you a human health related study of the use of hydrology to understand wetlands and health impacts. So in the first case, it's very common for wetlands to be drained for different land uses. This could be for pine plantations, could be for crop agriculture, or it could just be for mining peat out of a wetland. So in this case, the goal is to do a modeling analysis to do a head-to-head comparison of these different land use impacts on the water balance, including temporal changes in the water balance. So here are 4 different scenarios. The first scenario is a pristine wetland. The water table is pretty much at the ground surface, and we have a mix of herbaceous and shrub plants that are present. The second is if you create drains that drain the water away, and then that allows trees to grow there. The third is to enhance that by creating beds, like higher elevation beds, and then growing trees on top of those beds. And then the last condition is where, in addition to the beds, you take the drains and put a weir there, and then manually control to create more optimal conditions in what the water table position is at. The study was done in North Carolina. Here's a map that's showing Roanoke Island, Pamlico Sound. One of these in the East Dismal Swamp, and then another site to the south of the Neuse River. And there are some aerial shots to just put that into context for you. This is a schematic that shows how DRAINMOD works. It's pretty much just the nuts and bolts. I'm not going to go through the specific equations. There's a website for DRAINMOD. The model is freely available. So if you're interested in wetland hydrology or this kind of thing, then you can download that and use it in your research or consulting in the future. And what this schematic shows is just how the water balance works in the model. You have rainfall, ET, runoff. It has surface depression, which is this hatched area on the top. It has an infiltration function, and then it also has deep seepage. The next thing that this model can do that's a little bit unique is that it can actually bring in the human impacts associated with either subsurface drainage or subsurface irrigation. So first, let's look at drainage. If you put a pipe and it's perforated with holes all along it, you put that in the subsurface, what will happen is that the water table, which is shown as this black line, it will drop as water drains through that pipe. You know, the pipe is going, this is a cross section down, right? Like if you were to trench into the ground and you're looking straight into that pipe, that's what that circle represents, is a circular pipe. So the water is draining into the pipe and the water table is going to be lowest at the pipe. Now, why doesn't it all drain out? Well, because there's rainfall, and so rainfall will allow the system in steady state to maintain a higher water table away from the pipes, and so that's why it arcs. Now, if you take those pipes and instead of letting it draw water out, if you push water in, you can use that to do subsurface irrigation. And in that case, this dashed line shows the water table with water ponded up over those pipes and then at its lowest point in between them. So those are the essential nuts and bolts of how DRAINMOD works in terms of a water balance. In terms of the specifics for this study, hourly rainfall data was used to drive the model, and that came from weather stations. Infiltration was estimated using equations that use the soil characteristics like grain size distributions, initial porosity, initial moisture content, suction at the wetting front, things like that. Evapotranspiration, first get the potential evapotranspiration. That's the maximum evapotranspiration you could have given the energy available on that day, regardless of whether there's in fact enough water. Because let's say you can have the energy to take 10 units of water, but in fact on the ground there's only 2 units, right? So you have the potential ET of 10, but the actual, you could only take what's available. And so this calculates the potential and then adjusts for the actual based on the soil moisture. Groundwater is estimated using Darcy's law. Darcy's law says that water flows horizontally, essentially, horizontally because this is an unsaturated, unconfined aquifer context. So it's going to flow from areas of high water level, which is high pressure, to low pressure, and then that's mediated by the permeability of the soil. So the more permeable it is, the faster it can flow. The land use scenarios that were investigated included a natural condition, which basically has no drains in proximity, and the model has to have them somewhere, so it just puts them really far apart. Disturbed means removing all of the wetland vegetation, but otherwise keeping it as a wetland. And then we have 2 kinds of pine plantations, early and mature. These have 92-meter spaced drains and either an open or closed canopy. So you can imagine that trees might have greater interception and then evaporation associated with that, as well as potentially higher transpiration through trees than plants, although you don't really know that, so that has to be tested. Peat mining means removing the top 30 centimeters of material, which would reduce storage of water, as well as like if you have an impermeable layer, like this shows restrictive layer at the bottom. So if you take off a lot of that soil, you're probably just going to have a lot more surface runoff if you can't get through that impervious, restrictive layer. And then like a crop agriculture, which is changing the species that are present and having the drains that are there. So I'll show you 2 different kinds of results. The first is shown here with these water balances. The water balance, it's the same kind of diagram I showed earlier in this video podcast. Every case has 123 units of rainfall. The natural state has a moderate amount of ET. And if we come to the mature pine plantation, you can see that it has the highest evapotranspiration. So taking a wetland and turning it into a well-developed pine forest will yield greater ET. Conversely, if you take that natural wetland and you remove all the plants, you'll reduce ET, which means that you'll correspondingly increase runoff. If you mine out the peat, then you have a loss of wetlands and you have a loss of soil storage, and there's nowhere for water to infiltrate to. So you have the greatest reduction of ET and greatest increase of runoff. And then agriculture is sort of intermediate. This bar chart in the middle focuses just on the runoff side and gives you the total amount in cubic meters, times a million. And so you could just see, relatively speaking, mining has the greatest runoff by far, and then the forested condition has the least. If we look at how these fluxes change, we can run this mod flow simulation over a 20-year period and look at the monthly average results. So if we take the average of all 20 months, if we take the average in the month of January for all 20 years, and we do that for each scenario, we get the numbers that are shown here in runoff in centimeters. There's the most amount of precipitation in the winter, so you see like December, January, February, March having the most precipitation, and therefore overall a lot of runoff. Remember, when you have very high amounts of precipitation, you can overwhelm the storage capacity of the system, and so therefore you see really small differences in February and March. January does seem to show some differences. I'm not sure what's driving that. Possibly there's some differentiation in ET, but I'm not exactly sure why that would be so different. But the key thing is in the summertime. So June, July, August, September even, we have the case where we have very strong potential evapotranspiration. And so with the trees, with the trees, then you can see that they're going to be having very high evapotranspiration rates, whereas mining, in the absence of those trees and in the absence of soil storage, very high runoff at that time of the year, almost as much as you have during the winter time. Okay, so the last thing I want to show you is an example applying wetland hydrology to a problem of malaria management in Central America. So Belize is a country located at the along the edge of the coast, bounded by Mexico and Guatemala and the Atlantic Ocean. And so within Belize, this is a topographic map with very crude contours, but generally you can see that there's a transitional, like Piedmont, foothills region, and then the flat carbonate lowlands. And all of the black dots that are shown here are wetlands that have been part of a study that has been done in Belize. And what's interesting is that these wetlands vary from location to location as being either highly freshwater or highly saline, but the salinity is not coastal. It's not like there's no tidal exchange or anything. It must be from some other mechanism. And what's even more interesting is that the freshwater versus salty wetlands have very different species of mosquitoes and potential as vectors for bringing malaria to people who live near those. And so without getting into the details of that, from a management perspective, without having to just wipe out all of the wetlands like what happened in the coterminous United States to control malaria, here, if you could simply work on ways of modifying the salinity through water balance adjustments or other management, then it might be possible to create a gentler management strategy than just eliminating all wetlands. The field methods that were done here include satellite imagery to get the wetland area and which areas are vegetated versus unvegetated. Now, like if it's open water, then we could estimate those water evaporation rates from pan measurements made in Belize City. Manual rain gauges, like when you're working in a remote location like this, it's quite common to see manual observations. Now here's something interesting. Evapotranspiration was measured with something called an ET gauge. And if you go online and you look up ET gauge, just with no space, just ETGAGE, you'll find this instrument shown on the right. It's basically like the opposite of a rain gauge. Instead of having an empty bucket that you watch fill, you have a bucket here that starts with water in it. It's sealed. There's this graduated tube on the left where you can actually see the water level that's inside that can, essentially. And then inside here, there's a string that acts like a wick, kind of like a wick in a candle. And water will move up the wick to a ceramic plate at the top here. This has like a highly porous ceramic plate. So the ceramic is kept permanently wet by the wick. And then over that ceramic, you put a fabric that allows water to evaporate away, analogous to the kinds of evaporation that would be taking place due to the opening and closing of stomatal guard cells. So in this way, we can simulate evapotranspiration without having to actually do it on a real plant. In addition to that, water levels in the wetlands were measured with a staff gauge and water level recorders. These are generally bog-like settings with negligible runoff, so as a result of that, the water balance could be used to estimate groundwater flux. They did attempt to measure peat permeability like infiltration, but this is a place where infiltration is essentially zero, except where there are macropores and fractures that are present in the muck. And those are not places you can just go and find. So you use the water balance to see what the groundwater exchange is. So I'll show you two different kinds of results. The first is a water balance analysis. On the left is the time through months, and then across the top is either the change in ponded water levels, ET, and precipitation. So if we look at precipitation, what you can see is that they're generally like, well, this is showing three different periods, but it emphasizes that there's a period in the middle here that's dry, and then these other two periods on the top and bottom are wet. So if you come over here, this is May, April, May. So May, June, July, and then if we go around, August, September, October to November, like that's the dry season. And then November through May is, I'm sorry, that's the wet season. And then November through May is the rainy season. I just did it again. The November through May is the dry season, and May through November is the wet season. So the opposite of what we have here in California. So during the rainy season, you see that there's a range of precipitation that's taking place. Some wetlands having less and some have more. So this gray area is the range of variability present at these different sites. And similarly, if you look at ET is high when rain is high, but it's interesting, through the dry season, there's one period where you have very low ET and one period with very high ET. And then the water levels are generally positive, like ponded water during the rainy season, and then a loss of water so that water is below the ground surface during the dry season. So if we put this into a water balance, we can interpret this to try to get some insight about what's controlling salinity. So using the water balance, we can estimate the groundwater flux in millimeters per day, and we can contrast that between the wet season at the open circles and the dry season with the closed squares. During the wet season, if we look along the x-axis, it shows all these different marshes, and the red squares are the saline marshes, and then the green squares are the freshwater marshes. So all marshes have a net positive groundwater inflow. Like positive value here means that water is flowing in or discharging to the wetland. Okay, so every single site is above zero during the wet season. So this pink area is the discharging zone. So what happens when groundwater is flowing into a wetland? Well, the water is coming from somewhere. It's coming from the uplands, like raining on the mountains of Belize and the foothills, going into the ground. And in Central America, you have highly weatherable soils and you have carbonate rocks, and so it's going to pick up all kinds of minerals and bring that to the wetland. So during the wet season, all these wetlands are receiving that material. What differentiates the system is what happens during the dry season. If we look here, you can see that F2, F10, and F14, and to a lesser extent F12, like these are the wetlands that have the most release of water. These are wetlands that are sources. They're recharging water to downstream areas or the groundwater. So when water leaves as flow, whether it's surface flow or groundwater flow in this case, it takes the stuff in the water with it. When water evaporates away, the water goes and the stuff stays behind. And stuff in this case means the minerals, which means salinity. When you look at these saltier marshes, you can see that during the dry season, they either have very low groundwater fluxes, in most of these cases, or there's one here that has some amount of groundwater flux. But on average, on average, the saltier wetlands have significantly reduced groundwater outflow compared to the freshwater ones. And so that differentiation means that some of these are going to be retaining their salts because water is leaving by evaporation and transpiration. And so that creates that differentiation. So I think that shows two very different ways of using water balances to answer important management questions for wetlands related to wetland hydrology. So that's what I have to say about non-tidal, freshwater wetlands, and I hope you find that useful. You can take these things like this wetland interaction index, the WIL, or the source sink index, or these other water flux ways of looking at things, and you can very quickly give a client or a scientific study a good idea of what is important about the hydrology of the wetland.